All right, so today, like I said, we're going to be talking about apocalyptic literature as the last thing. And we'll talk about interpreting Apocalypse. This is the books we're typically talking about. There is Revelation, which is what most Christians think of when I think of the apocalypse or an apocalypse. But no, there's a lot of apocalyptic literature also in the prophets. There's heavy images, and we'll get into this, but I think one of the keys to understanding Revelation properly is actually to really understand the Old Testament. There is so much crossover that I think it has more Old Testament references, quotes, things than probably any other book. Maybe Hebrews has about as much as that or more, but Revelation is heavy with borrowed things from the Old Testament. Also in the Gospels, even Jesus, a lot of people who study the Gospels and even non-Christians will say Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher. That's what he was. He saw that an age was coming to an end and there was a new age to come and a new dawning of history, and that history would culminate in God's judgment. And Jesus was preaching about some of that judgment, and so there's definitely truth to that. And so there's parts of the Gospels, we'll get to it in a Mark, that are apocalyptic, as Jesus uses this heavy imagery to describe the end of certain things and God's judgment and the certainty of things to come. And so you see that in the Gospels, even with Jesus. And then you even see some of the apostles. 2 Thessalonians, Paul talks about the Antichrist, the resurrection, what is to come, what's to come of the church. 2 Peter, similarly, Peter talks about the world being destroyed by fire and these apocalyptic images. And then the book of Jude as well even borrows from an apocalyptic literature outside the Bible, talking about some events from the book of Enoch and Jude. But yeah, it's just good to be aware that Revelation isn't the only place where apocalyptic literature is. It's in other parts of the Bible as well. It is pretty unique, typically, to the Bible, however, or kind of Jewish literature much of the time. And so it's good to keep that in mind. It's a genre that really doesn't exist anymore. People don't tend to write like this. So it's unique coming to us and kind of obviously takes some work, which is why people really struggle with books like Revelation. We can talk a little bit about, I wanted to mention, what is apocalypse? What does that actually mean? How do we get there? The word apocalypse comes from a Greek word, apocalypsis, and it really just is a word that means like a revealing, an unveiling. What else did I put in here? A revelation, a disclosure. That's what the word actually means. And so that's where the words came from. And usually the genre that this is there's some prophet or some figure who's saying God is revealing something to me. He's disclosing something. And it's different than kind of other ways, right? Because in the past, as we read some of the Old Testament prophets and things, they kind of say, hey, God came to me and spoke to me. Or you have the epistles where God is kind of working alongside Paul's experiences, his authority as apostle. And so what comes out in the epistles is what God wanted. But it's not as direct, I guess. I'm trying to grasp for the word. As much as the Spirit working alongside the person, where apocalyptic literature is delivered right to the person through visions primarily. Not, you're going to say this, but you'll notice in apocalyptic literature there's a lot more visions than there are, hey, this is what I want you to say. And what the interpretation comes through a lot of these visions and images and things like that. And that's consistent even with apocalyptic literature outside the Bible. And so that's where this idea of an apocalypse comes from, is this, it's God revealing something supernaturally. It's a good illustration of sort of, if you've ever seen Wizard of Oz, he's pulling the curtain back, but behind it isn't, some fake guy with a machine. It's God kind of pulling the curtain back to see, like, this is what's happening in the spiritual realm behind all these things on earth that are happening. There's a whole nother universe, there's a whole other dimension, so to speak, where things are happening and things are unfolding. And these two realms interacts with one another. What happens in the spiritual affects the earthly, and what happens in the earthly affects the spiritual. But they're two very real realities. So when we talk about apocalyptic literature, then, this is what we're talking about. It's a type of biblical literature where God reveals unseen spiritual realities and His sovereign plan for history through vivid imagery, often containing symbolic visions. And so that's God's goal. God didn't give it to us to confuse us, to confound us. It's a bit removed from us, so like the prophets, it's difficult for the modern reader. But with some work, we can come to understand it. And it's just another unique way that God's communicated, revealing Himself, who He is, how He works to us. And much of the time in this literature, He's trying to communicate these spiritual realities or His sovereign plan for history, that history isn't accidental, that God is bringing this somewhere, it's going somewhere, though to us, like in Ecclesiastes, it might seem chaotic, random, all over the place, that God is sovereignly ruling over history, and things are happening even in the spiritual realm that we're often unaware of or don't know, that God is bringing about. So that was one thing I actually enjoyed preaching through Ephesians when we got here. Paul has a lot to say there about us being blessed with every spiritual blessing in the heavenlies. He describes the church as the manifold wisdom of God, that the heavenly beings are looking into the church and seeing God's wisdom as it unfolds in us, which is a crazy thought. So it's pretty interesting. But when we're talking about apocalyptic literature, the apocalypse, that's what we're talking about. Sometimes you'll even hear people refer to John as the Apocalypse of John, which is not a bad name. It's just the only thing that we need to have a caveat in this, and I'll get to this in warnings of Revelation, is not thinking that everything is some sort of roadmap to tell us every detail of the distant future. Revelation was likely written in the first century, around 100 A.D., and it was likely written and given to John to really help the churches at that time and encourage them and understand some of what was happening. And that was really a time when persecution for the Christian church began to significantly increase. So it would have been an important letter for them to know, like, hey, God's control of history in spite of you're getting persecution from the state now. Rome is getting pretty wild in terms of a lot of things, of immorality and all sorts of things. And these Christians needed to know that God's still sovereign, God's in control, God has a plan for history, and that Christ was still reigning on the throne. Any questions so far about apocalyptic literature in general, Revelation, some of those other books?
I am curious. What did you think God uses this symbolic way to reveal something?
Mm-hmm.
To do it your opinion.
Yeah, I think a couple different reasons. One, to be honest, I just don't think God's boring. I think He's pretty creative, and I think communicating to us in different ways helps us to capture that a little bit who God is, rather than just straight telling us. In the same way that, like, I could tell you. I could tell you the same story in a lot of different ways. I could tell you just the facts, or I can paint you a picture with my words, or I can show you a picture. So I think there's a wisdom to God in revealing Himself in different ways and showing us and helping us Him to see in different ways, and really to even capture us by His glory and beauty. I think that's one part of it. I think, two, at the time where a lot of this revelation was given, these were familiar kinds of literature to the people. So for us, it's very foreign at times. For them, these would have been things that fit into their worldview. It's just now we're looking backwards on these things. And so in some ways we have it easier because, we have the entire Bible. We have the books collected. The church has grown in its theology. There's a lot we've hammered out. But in some ways it's harder because culturally and contextually we're just removed from some of these things. But God has enabled and equipped us as the church to be able to connect those dots and go back to these things. I think another aspect of it is even the straightforward things can be misunderstood. I mean, we see that in the Pharisees. We're going to see that in Mark. You would think things like honor your mother and father are pretty straightforward. And that's going to get pretty bent out of shape with all sorts of things. Or to love your neighbor. But people tend to use it. So there's no guarantee that even if it was more straightforward in our minds, that it would be any clearer. And then I think sometimes these genres of literature, maybe even more than the straightforward method, tend to transcend cultures and time a little bit more. So those are some of the reasons I think of. Anyone else, any other thoughts? Why would God communicate in just other ways other than just like, hey, here it is?
I think it would make us more close-minded if we had an exact pathway to what the future would be. We would only be looking for one thing, and we would perhaps ignore other signs or other, I hate to use the word things, but...
Yeah, so I think some of the most important things are pretty straightforward, but there's other things that are a little harder, and yeah, that's a good point. I think, too, God often wants us to see wider than we want to look. We want to find some particular thing. We have our presuppositions. We did that in the beginning of this class, our commitments. And oftentimes God's trying to help us see things that we don't even see. So often Jesus is doing that with people in the Gospels of like, you have this very narrow understanding of this verse, this story, whatever it is, not seeing the bigger picture that God has in this. Anyone else? Any other thoughts?
Do you think it's that, like, the person writing sees a vision,
Mm-hmm.
and it's things that are in the future that they don't understand fully? Like,
Mm-hmm.
things they see are future things that are not in their world at the moment.
Yeah. Well, maybe. They may or may not be future.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason that they write it that way, because they're trying to describe something that they don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly some things they don't fully grasp, but in order to communicate it, like, right, even in Revelation, like, John interprets some of the symbols. He says the 7 lampstands represent the 7 churches, and the 7 stars do this. So some of the symbols he does understand, and there's some parts where he's like, I don't understand, and the angel explains it to him. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a both and. I think there's some things they didn't fully grasp, but I think they probably knew more than we think, oftentimes. But yeah, they're hard realities and cosmic things sometimes beyond full human comprehension. But whether it's always future or not is another question. So we'll get into that.
Well, like Ezekiel, when he sees the vision of God's glory and then describing these wheels that are moving around, he's describing something that's probably indescribable, in my mind at least.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily apocalyptic, but...
Yeah, and I think of even Paul in Corinthians. That's one of my favorite things. Whenever there's people who, like, every once in a while you see those people who make the news, like, I went into heaven or hell and came back, and I'm going to tell you about it. For one, usually their comparison to the biblical accounts is already way off, so I'm like, that's not good. But two, the one person that we know of, well, the 2 people we know of, Christ has been into heaven and returned. He doesn't comment too much about the details of too much, but then Paul talks about in Corinthians having a vision of heaven, and his point is like, there's just too many things I can't even describe. So I'm like, if Paul the Apostle said that, I'm always weary of people claiming they had these heavenly experiences or going into hell and coming back. And yeah, so I'm a little weary of those things. If the people we knew best didn't say too much about them after coming back from that experience. So, yeah. Anyone else? Thoughts, questions about apocalyptic literature? I'm sure some of your questions we'll get into, but I'm hoping we'll have some time at the end, because I know people always have a lot of questions about Revelation. And I don't know if I'm going to have satisfactory answers for everyone. So, but I'll share as much as I know and my perspective on it. So, let's just talk about characteristics of apocalyptic literature. What makes it apocalyptic? What can you expect to see in some of the prophets and Jesus' teaching in the book of Revelation? The first one is it's seen and written divine revelation. So there's going to be a lot more visions, and it's actually intended to be read. Remember when we talked about the prophets, originally, the prophets were really meant to be heard. And they were speaking God's word to people, and eventually it got written down. Probably by a lot of times other people than the prophets. They probably collected a lot of their teaching, wrote it down, and then collected it in these books for future generations of Israel and whoever might come after them. But when it comes to apocalyptic literature, it is actually meant to be read and written down. And that's why when you read in Revelation, it says, "Blessed is the one who reads this prophecy." So that's characteristic of apocalyptic literature. And then, like I said, that there'll be these visions rather than oral speech or specific things given to preach. So you'll see that as a characteristic. There's also going to be visions and descriptions. As it comes with these visions, as they see things, there's going to be vivid descriptions of imagery, symbology, things that are real, things that are symbolic but represent real things. So we're going to see that heavily throughout of the author, whoever is writing it, having visions. One thing I didn't write in here that I'll mention now is something that was really popular with apocalyptic literature that is sort of unique to Revelation, that it's not this. It was often pseudonymous. There was often not an author identified. They weren't concerned with saying who they were. They weren't the main character. But Revelation is kind of unique. And John identifying himself, saying who he was. And even Revelation, technically, we'll get to this, is not just apocalyptic. It's actually a combination of apocalyptic literature, prophetic literature, and an epistle. Because the first couple chapters of Revelation, you have epistles from Christ to these churches. And so there's kind of even uniqueness in that of what Revelation is, that it's not purely just apocalyptic literature. And so a lot of what we learned in the prophets, if you want to go back and listen, will also apply to reading Revelation. And some of what we learned in the epistles as well, and understanding that. Another thing that's very common to popular literature is this idea of God's providence in history. It's not accidental. It's not incidental. Men make their choices, but God is still sovereign and providential over history. He has a plan that is ultimately going to culminate and come to fruition, and He will bring that about despite whatever man may or may not do. It's not going to stop God's plan from moving forward. And so you're going to, if you've read the book of Revelation, you see that too. I mean, there's one guy who writes a commentary just called The Lamb Wins. And in some sense, that's true. That's like some of what the book of Revelation is in a nutshell. It's to remind us as Christians, look, Christ wins this thing. Like when the world's dark and the world's horrible and there's these horrible state empires bringing persecution and immorality is rampant, Christ is still in control and Christ still wins. And so you see God's providential hand over history. It's trying to show some of that through apocalyptic imagery. There's going to be a lot of symbolic imagery. The one thing to be aware of or careful of is just because something's symbolic doesn't mean it doesn't represent an actual reality. It just means there's not a one-to-one correspondence. And so the four horsemen of the apocalypse, there probably won't be actually four guys who come riding out of heaven on horses who bring about these plagues. But it doesn't mean that the pestilence, the plagues, the things that these images represent won't really happen. And so we have to be careful with that. The symbols are not meant to be symbols for symbol's sake, or to keep it's different than a metaphor. Symbols are in a place of representing something that is real. And so you could even think of it as simple as, right, like our church logo. Our church logo in itself is just a church logo. But the church, us existing as Churchill Baptist, is a real thing, even though that represents us. And you could do that with a whole lot of things. So there's going to be a lot of symbolic imagery. There's going to be a lot of mythological and Old Testament connections. We talked a little bit about the Old Testament, but John, also in Revelation, there's a lot of elements of mythology that he adopts. This is something that we have to be careful of, though, is although he borrows imagery from other mythologies, doesn't necessarily mean he's using them in the same way. So, for example, if you've read the Old Testament, there's almost nothing about dragons in there, and then yet John starts talking about this imagery of a dragon in Revelation. He's borrowing from Greek mythology, where dragons were prevalent in these things, but he's not using it exactly in the same way that dragons would have been used in Greek mythology. And so you have to let Revelation stand on its own account. Remember, the Bible wasn't always put together. And so the first place you want to look for, hey, I think this might be a symbol, is there any hint in the book that would indicate what this symbol or what this represents? And it's pretty clear, regardless of people's view on Revelation, they almost all agree that the dragon refers to Satan, and it identifies him as Satan. But it's used in its imagery. But I don't think it's as if Satan's going to actually appear as this giant fire-breathing dragon. But it's imagery that he's using of what Satan's like and what he does. And he's borrowing that image from mythology. And there's other things, like, for example, it talks about Satan coming out of the sea, the great dragon coming out of the sea towards Babylon. In ancient times and for ancient Romans, the sea was a place known to be chaotic, to be scary. That's where a lot of the stories of mythological creatures came from. And so many times the sea represented disorder, chaos, immorality, sinfulness, lack of clarity. And so no wonder this would be kind of where Satan is coming from. If probably more than he's saying that Satan will actually appear out of the ocean as a giant dragon. He's saying Satan is coming from this system in this world that is full of chaos and death and uncertainty, and that's from which Satan rules and reigns. And then he's going to come onto the earth to try to bring that type of thing to earth in what he's doing. So you're going to see those elements. Common in apocalyptic literature, too, is heavenly intermediaries. Notice John continually has this kind of conversation with an angel throughout. It's very common in apocalyptic literature as well, as God will sort of send this intermediary or representative to talk to the person and help them interpret, who's showing them the visions and bringing them around. That happens in Revelation. Another huge one is cosmic conflict and outlook. Apocalyptic literature is not so much trying to speak so clearly historically into the situation as, like I said, it's trying to pull the curtain back on both current events and future events of this is what's happening in the unseen world in all of these things. And so there's very much this cosmic outlook of what's happening in the heavenlies. What is God doing? What conversations are happening in the spiritual world, and how is this all part of God's plan unfolding on earth, and trying to show us what's happening behind that curtain, so to speak. And then apocalypse, as typically associated, usually comes to an end with some sort of recognition of God's final judgment, God exercising his authority or power over this world, bringing history to a pointed end and showing forth his judgment. And Revelation is certainly not short of that. And as you read the prophets, as you read Christ, and when they write about apocalyptic things or share these things, they're often refer to God's judgment that will come, whether it's for Israel or for a future generation or the generation that's there. But yeah, these are kind of characteristics of how do people know whether something is apocalyptic literature or not? These are the elements that you typically see. And like I said, pseudonymy could be in there, but typically the author's not identified, but Revelation's a little bit unique in that. Any questions? Yeah.
Could you also perhaps add symbolic numbers?
Yes. Maybe I did put that in there. Oh, no, I didn't. We'll get into that later. But, yeah, there's definitely, in apocalyptic literature, numbers can have significance beyond themselves. The key is, again, let the context determine that. Because I think there are some times in Revelation where the number does symbolize something else. And there's other times it's just talking about a number. So, for example, the 7 lampstands. There's 7 lampstands because it says they represent 7 churches. And it names what those specific churches are. Now, as Jesus gives these epistles to John, to the pastors of these churches are also meant to be representative of the church at large, even though he's speaking to these specific churches. Well, it's just why the John's revelation gets passed on to more than just these churches written down, and eventually to us. So it has significance for us, even though it was given to these specific churches. But yes. So the answer is I think you gotta let the context determine it. I think sometimes people read numbers, and my question would be, hey, if you think this number is symbolic or has some significance beyond the number itself, then you need to prove it to me from the text. What in the text would tell you something is going on here? Like the 666 number is a great example. He literally says, like, let the reader understand. He gives all these hints of, like, this number means something more than just 666, which he's trying to infer to the reader. I forget which one it is the writer does. Imply. The reader infers. Imply to the reader, hey, this means something beyond what I'm saying. Versus there are other times where it's like, yeah, I don't think that's a symbolic number. He's just mentioning a number. Any other questions? Apocalyptic literature. All right. So we talked about this book of Revelation. It's really 3 genres in one. So it's just good to recognize that. Depending on where you are in Revelation, you'll see all of these elements in it. And I think this will be helpful for you guys. So let's just talk about views of Revelation. There's typically 4 major views of understanding Revelation and what it is. So the first one, and these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but clean categories for ease purposes. There's Futurism, which tends to see Revelation primarily predicts future events. It's things that are going to happen in the future. God's telling us what's going to happen later. And Revelation's fulfillment then is mostly future fulfillment. The tribulation, the Antichrist, the return of Christ, judgment, new creation. These are all things that have not yet happened, and that's going to happen in the future. That's the basic idea. Futurism, easy to remember. There's another one that's kind of the reverse of that. That's called Preterism. And that idea is that Revelation is primarily addressed to events near John's original audience. That John's actually, the preterist position is that most of Revelation is already fulfilled. That it happened at the time of the Roman Empire. And there might be a few things they would hold out and so on and say, well, obviously Christ hasn't fully returned. The new earth doesn't exist yet. But for a lot of Revelation, they would say, John was writing about things happening in the Roman Empire right there and then. To the church existing, and the great whore of Babylon is Rome. 666 represents people like Nero, who was the emperor at the time, and so these things have kind of already come to pass. There's a great tribulation that happens as the temple was destroyed. The Romans come in and kind of Christians scatter from Jerusalem, all sorts of things. So they view that mostly this was fulfilled in the 1st century, especially on the judgment in Jerusalem in AD 70. That's when the temple was destroyed. And so they would view much of Revelation from that perspective. And that's called a preterist view, or preterism. Then there's Historicism. Revelation symbolically traces the entire history of the church age. And so it's this idea of Jesus inaugurated this new age, a new covenant. It's a church age, and it's really representing the church and all that will happen of the church for all time. And so it will have these images and things, but the church will always be persecuted. The church will always have tribulation. The church will always have Satan against it. Christ will ultimately win in the end, but they would view it as mostly this symbolic and progressive representation of what happens throughout church history until Christ's return. And then there's this another view called Idealism, which is Revelation symbolically portrays the ongoing conflict between Christ and evil. And so when you think of idealism, they think of Revelation as sort of, you can think of it as like cyclical or cycles. It's not Revelation. The idealist would say Revelation is not written chronologically. It's written as a cycle. And it's retelling the same story from different perspectives over and over and over again. And so kind of similar to Historicism, they're viewing it that all those things are fulfilled in this age with what happens with the church. And so really Revelation is written for the church for all times, of saying, again, this is always going to happen. But they would understand Revelation as almost cyclical or these multiple wheels turning, so to speak. I should have used like a line to represent all these because it would have been easy. But if you can imagine Futurism views Revelation left to right with an arrow pointing this way towards the future. Preterism views Revelation as pointing the other way. It points towards the past of things that have already completed. Historicism almost views the book of Revelation as like a spiral downwards, like this. And then idealism would be like a line that goes from left to right to the future, but it would be like this. It would be in loops. If you guys want to know what my particular view is, to be honest, I don't fit into any particular category. I see blends of all of these. I think there are parts of Revelation that refer to the past. I think there are things that are yet to come. I do see a form of recapitulation in Revelation where it kind of tells the same stories from different perspectives. But I also see that I think there is a progression. And I don't know, depending how you want to view it, progression downward, progression upward. Progression downward as in the world gets crazier and crazier until Christ comes and it gets as bad as it's going to get right before he comes. Upward if you view it as Christ is reigning and is going to bring his kingdom and we're going to enter into a new earth. But I think the spiral analogy is probably the best one for me. So I guess if I had to fit in something, it would be Historicism of I view Revelation as this spiral that's continuing downward at the bottom, being this is the worst it's ever going to get. But in some ways, I see that it's true that what categorizes Revelation is the case. That at the time when this was written, Rome was certainly a threat to Christianity and the state of that time. There have been continued empires since. And so to me, I guess what it is it's like these cycles continually happening where Satan raises up powers and things to persecute the church. But I also see it as progressive of it's actually getting worse and worse and worse. And there'll come a time that it's going to get worse than it ever was. So in my view, simultaneously, I think Babylon can represent Rome while also at the same time representing future kingdoms and an ultimate future kingdom that will oppose Christ. And that all of those things are fair interpretations, and that symbol can simultaneously represent that opposition at the same time. So that's my position. I haven't preached through Revelation. I would like to eventually, but it's not on my docket for super soon. But that's just a little bit of description of my position on it. So, any questions on these views? All right, hopefully that's helpful. I didn't make a chart for this, but now that I'm thinking it might be helpful because you'll just hear these terms. Another some other popular terms you'll hear is premillennial, postmillennial, and amillennial. It's kind of unfortunate that people sometimes categorize their whole view based on those things, but you'll hear those terms. What all those positions refer to is a chapter in Revelation. I think it's Revelation 20. It might be 21. But basically, there's a time where it talks about... Let me just go there, make sure I don't get it wrong. In Revelation 24, I'll just read it, 24 through 6. We'll follow John's instructions. Blessed is the one who reads the prophecy. It says this, Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. Also I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God. And those who had not worshipped the beast or its image had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. And the rest of the dead did not come to life until 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. So when you think of those three terms, premillennial, before millennium, when you think of amillennial, when you put an A or an A sound in Latin before something, it negates it. So it literally means no millennium. Or when you think postmillennium, it means after the millennium. Those are three views that understand this text differently. And they kind of fit into these four categories. I should have put another chart of kind of where people tend to be. But there are some people who think when it comes to this millennium, the most popular view is probably amillennial, no millennium. They think this 1,000 years is a symbolic number that just defines an indefinite period of time, or really all the time between Christ's first coming and his second coming. And so their argument would be, look, Christ rules and reigns right now. And he's been reigning since he ascended back into heaven. And therefore, this 1,000 years is really just representative of the whole church age in which Christ rules over his church and rules over the world. So that's the most popular view in church history. That's probably the view of 80%, if not more, of Christians, whether they know that term or not. And in some ways, it's, I don't want to say the easiest view, but maybe the simplest to explain, because it's essentially, hey, things get worse and worse, and then Christ shows back up one day in second coming, boom, final judgment, all said and done, new earth, new creation, and it's just kind of simple in that way. And there's biblical basis for this. I have many good friends convicted of this view. Many people much smarter than I am convicted of this view. But that's premillennialism. Amillennialism. Premillennialism takes the view typically that this 1,000 years is literal, and that before the final state of the world, a new earth and everything is renewed and final resurrections happen, that there's actually a reign of Christ on earth for 1,000 years. And that Christ comes back, but he doesn't restore everything immediately. But he does become literally, he sits on the throne of David on earth and becomes king. But people continue to sin and rebel against him. He just puts an end to sort of all the governments, and he's just like, I'm king of the earth now, and this is how it's going to go for the next 1,000 years. And so they would talk about things like point to Christ ruling on earth, or to Psalm 2 that he'll rule the nations with a rod of iron. It's kind of Christ bringing order back into the world, but some people even continue to rebel against Christ even as he rules over the world. So the whole idea in premillennial is before the millennium, Christ will return. Versus with amillennial, there isn't really a millennium, so he just comes back. And then there's postmillennialism, which is really the idea of, how do I explain this well, that essentially, the church kind of ushers in the millennium. I don't know, Michael. How would you describe postmillennialism? He's in seminary, so they probably talked about it a lot.
A lot of Puritanism, when they came from like Europe and the chaos, and they ushered in America, what they're believing they're taking over, like, oh, we are the new Israel of God.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is all we're going to usher in this new age of the millennial kingdom here in America.
Yeah.
A lot of what they had.
So it's this idea of, kind of like the church is going to bring heaven to earth. So in postmillennialism, what's kind of unique is in their view, things get better before Christ returns. Because the church is here, Christ is reigning through his church, and by the church being the church and being faithful Christians, like the world just gets so transformed that it's overtaken eventually by the gospel. And like the gospel gets to all the nations and it kind of becomes Christianized. If you guys have been kind of keeping up with the news or kind of like Christian news, a lot of the things having to do with Christian nationalism and things like that stem from theology of postmillennialism. And their kind of criticism to the amillennials and the premillennialists is, you guys are kind of like, hey, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. You guys just fold your hands, go into your churches and preach, but never help anyone or do anything in society. And they're like, we're going to be the church, and we're going to go into the society, and we're going to make amazing art, and we're going to train people to be fair judges, and we're going to be the church and do all these things. So that's kind of their criticism sometimes to the other camps. So, but that's probably the least popular view of them, although it's become a lot more popular in the last decade especially. Alongside political activism and some other things that happened from the 60s to the 2000s, postmillennial is getting really cool and really popular again. But you'll hear those terms: premillennial, postmillennial, amillennial. I'm sure if you search the internet, it will give you better explanations for those three things than even I did.
It seems like when I heard those terms, they're referring to the placement of the rapture
Mm-hmm.
rather than the actual second coming.
It is. It does talk about that as well. But the thing is, all millennials don't believe there's a rapture. So that goes with millennium. So in one sense, yes, but that more has to do with what you'll hear attached to them. You'll hear things pre-trib, post-trib, alongside premillennial. And so what they're saying is, someone might say, I'm a pre-trib, premillennial. What they mean is, I believe Christ will physically come and rule in 1,000 years. Before that, I think there will be a tribulation in which the existing church at that time will be raptured. But you can have people who are post-trib, premillennialists, and what they mean is the church will go through the Great Tribulation, but I still believe Christ will come back and reign on earth for 1,000 years. So, and then there's even people who are mid-tribbers. They say the church will go halfway through the revelation, through the tribulation, but not through the Great Tribulation, the second half of it. So that's usually where the tribulation conversation comes in. But you're right, Janie, in the sense of, depending on what view you take, whether it's these or what I just mentioned, you probably there's typically things that go together. If you believe in a rapture, you're probably some sort of premillennial. If you don't believe in a rapture, you're either amillennial or postmillennial probably. So there's kind of pairings that go together. But yeah, fun terms. But I'm sure if you go to questions.org, websites like that got questions. There's some good Google websites, and just ask what are different views of end times. They'll have simple articles that are just really helpful for understanding what do Christians believe. And I think the truth is, I think Christians make two errors with things like Revelation. I think some people go to the one side, and this is what my friend and old pastor would say. He's like, I'm a pan-millennialist, because it's all going to pan out in the end. And that's what he'd call himself. And to me, I'm like, I get what he's saying, and in some ways I agree. You need to approach Revelation and even end times with humility. I mean, heck, if humanity got so much wrong about Jesus' first coming, there's probably things that all of us have wrong about his second coming. But also, he did give us revelation, and there are specificities, and there's prophecy in the Bible, and there are things in the Bible in Jesus' first coming that were clear, that did literally happen. He literally was born in Nazareth. He literally was pierced. He was in the ground 3 days. He was resurrected. So there's a little bit of both, and so I would give him a hard time of like, that's the lazy man's way out of like, I don't really want to pick a position, so I'll just say, I'll do this. So I think that's one error, is kind of just like, I'll never read Revelation, it's too hard, I'll leave it alone. And then the other error is like just being so particular and having no humility and being super dogmatic and everything. There are many Christian brothers and sisters, like I said, much smarter theologians and faithful students of Scripture more than me, who have different positions than I do. And I love them and I respect them. And like, I just oftentimes, when it comes to it, we'll have fun, we'll talk, we'll have serious conversations, we'll argue with Scripture together. But like, I think I heard this in a video once, but it's true. I'm like, look, if you're right, all millennialists, like, they view, there's no rapture, Christ comes back, and if you're alive then, you get transformed into your resurrected body right there and then. I'm like, look, I'll just change my theology, like, post-transformation. You're right. Like, we'll be there. Like, I don't get, like, you think I'm still going to be worried about it, like, when we're in the final stage here? And then for him, I'm like, when we're getting raptured, you can just change it halfway up in the air. You can be like, I was wrong. Here we go. So I'm like, either way, like, I guess all that to say is, in either view, neither of us are so sad to be wrong. And ultimately, like I said, what we do agree on, whether it's any three of these views or these four views, is that Christ will reign, he is sovereign, and there will be a final resurrection and a new earth and an eternity that's ahead of us. So, like I said, I think you kind of have to keep both of those things in tension. Have some humility over here, but not be so neglectful and dismissive on one side. And quite frankly, as a pastor, I think it's just more pressing for me to hold a view, because I don't think it's particularly helpful for you guys. If I ever preached Revelation one day, yeah, you could take the approach where I could try to interpret Revelation every sermon these four ways. But I think y'all would end up more confused than it would be helpful. And then it's like, if my pastor can't even preach it and pick a view, how am I going to do that? So part of it is God gave it for us for understanding. And I want to be able to stand before the Lord in good conscience one day and say, look, I tried to faithfully take your word and teach to the flock as much as I could. And I didn't ignore the hard parts or neglect it because I was like, it was hard. I just don't think that's a great answer for a shepherd to give when we're taught to preach the whole counsel of God. We got to preach the hard parts, the difficult parts as well. But yeah, it does take diligent study. So those are some of the views. So we'll talk about principles, and we can kind of end with this, which will be good timing. Principles for interpreting Revelation, I think that will be helpful. One is just actually read Revelation. Some people are like, especially new Christians, sometimes they're like, I'm scared to read it, Pastor. Like, it's crazy in there. It's wild. I don't even want to touch it. I just want to read about Jesus and the Gospels and these other things. I'm like, you should read Revelation too. It is true that there's a blessedness to reading it. And it's great that we have it. God gave it to us. You don't need to be afraid, even if you don't understand every tidbit. I would encourage you at least just familiarize yourself with it. And then remember, when John wrote it, probably in the first century, it was meant to be an encouragement to the Christians, both a warning and an encouragement. And so let it serve as an encouragement to you now when you're feeling hopeless, down. So many people, look at the state of even our own country and kind of being further and further away from the Lord. And those are the type of things that you can point them to. Look, man, Christ still rules on the throne. Like, yeah, maybe America does go down. Romans went down. Persians went down. Ottoman Empire went down. We're going to fall eventually. But Christ is still reigning. And even if it turns into statewide persecution for us, like, that's the ironic thing is Christians kind of sometimes complain now, and not saying that it's wrong to sort of, fight back against the state when it uses its authority inappropriately or unjustly. I think that's something Christians should do and call out when it happens. But at the same time, sometimes I think as Americans particularly, I'm like, have you ever read church history? Do you know the people that Christians were living under? That when Paul wrote Romans 12 and to submit to the government, like 40 years later, there's people being lit on fire in Nero's garden and being torn apart in the Colosseum, and they're submitting to that government, and you're complaining about our government because you got to pay a little more taxes from time to time, or, whatever it may be, the LGBTQ flag. I'm like, I get it. We fight against injustice. We don't approve of things that are wrong. We live with a clean conscience. But at the same time, perspective helps sometimes it could be a lot worse compared to what's happening. So, and the truth is you read church history too, something that's really encouraging is like, to be honest, the times when the church thrives the most is usually when the state starts persecuting it. Because, man, there is nothing that clears out people who aren't really Christians like persecution. And there's nothing like God likes to work when the people of God are put in a corner, beat down, and in suffering, and the witness can just go forth. I mean, we even see that in the book of Acts as the apostles are whipped and persecuted. And literally the report from the Jewish leaders is you have turned the world upside down with your teaching. And as you look at church history when the church is persecuted, like that's what Christ does in his church. He's like, he turns the world upside down and people come to Christ like no other time, and shining moments like that. And so we're not sadists. We don't wish and like, yes, persecution, but we also want to endure persecution. We want to suffer well, knowing that God is bringing about his will even through the church's suffering and persecution. So, read Revelation. Number 2, recognize the genre. Just remember, it's epistle, apocalypse, and prophetic literature. So as you read Revelation, I mean, pretty straightforwardly in the beginning, there's a little bit of apocalypse, but some epistle and some epistle at the end. Throughout, there's going to be both prophecy and apocalypse. So just know the genre that you're in as you're reading it. And it's not going to read as simple as a gospel or an Old Testament narrative or an epistle. So it's probably going to take a little more work, a little more thinking as you go through this with an unfamiliar genre. Study the historical context. I would encourage you to do some background reading, particularly on the Roman Empire and what the church was like in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Who were the emperors? How did Christianity start to get persecuted? How did they even get on the radar of Rome? Read about Nero, Diocletian, the Great Fire of Rome, which Nero blamed on Christians as kind of they would have viewed it the new cult, the new religion in town, which brought a lot of attention to Christians. But try to just study a little bit of church history, just the 1st and 2nd century of what the church was like, who was alive, who was saying what were the things happening. It will bring a lot of context to you in Revelation to understand the type of suffering and persecution the Christians who originally received this were going through, and the type of theological error they were battling, those types of things. Number 4, look for interpreted symbols within Revelation. And so if you have a sense of something a symbol, like I said earlier, the best place to look is just the book of Revelation itself. Does the book interpret what the symbol is? Does it say what the woman is? Does it say what Babylon is? The 7 lampstands, the stars, the bowls of wrath, the horsemen of the apocalypse, all these things. Sometimes John just identifies what they are. The great dragon with Satan, these types of things, or interpreting the creatures with 10 horns. He talks about 10 kings and different things. So look for, in the book of Revelation, if those symbols are interpretive. The next thing I would do is actually look to the Old Testament. Oftentimes the symbols are, like I said, some are borrowed from mythology and give it a new meaning. But a lot of them are in the Old Testament. Man, if you read particularly Daniel, Ezekiel, and Isaiah, Revelation borrows a lot of imagery from those 3 books. And so if you understand a little bit about their prophecies and theirs, you'll understand more about Revelation as he borrows some of those images and brings them into Revelation as God reveals this to him. Another one, interpret numbers and symbols in their context. Similarly, look at what's around the verse, before the verse, after the verse. Try to look at what their context is and interpret it within its context. Like I said, not every number, I think, in Revelation is meant to be symbolic, but I think some are. And I think context is going to dictate that. Are there clues in the text itself that seem to tell us that those are symbolic numbers of some kind? Number 6, cross-reference the Old Testament, which I just talked about. There's not only a lot of quotations, but there's just a lot of allusion with an A, to the Old Testament. And so if you've read the prophets pervade throughout Revelation. That he just takes things picks up on themes and things that the prophets preached on and brings them into Revelation and speaks on them. So it'll be really, really helpful that if you really want to understand Revelation and Hebrews are 2 books that you just have to have a solid understanding of the Old Testament to really get a lot out of them. Because they're building off of the Old Testament, particularly prophecy for Revelation. For Hebrews, a lot of Old Testament law. So you want to cross-reference the Old Testament. And oftentimes, if you guys don't know, some of you might be new to your Bible. A lot of Bibles, you'll notice when you read them, there's little letters next to some of the verses. And then usually in the middle or the bottom, there'll be a corresponding letter at the bottom or middle of your Bible. Those are what cross-references is, and what the translators are trying to tell you is, hey, there's another verse somewhere in the Bible that says something kind of like this, or that the author is quoting from, and you should go check out this reference. And so if you're somebody who's new to your Bible, I encourage you every once in a while, if you read a verse you don't understand, and there's a little letter there with a cross-reference, try to look up those cross-references and see, okay, this cross-reference says it's the letter. I'm just looking at my iPad here. There's one with a Q, and if I hit it, it says, go look back at Revelation 14:10. I'm in Revelation 16. And then I can go back and look at Revelation 14:10. But sometimes it'll be to books outside of it. And so cross-references can be really helpful. The translators are trying to give you hints to other parts of the Bible that may relate to what's there. But like every other book, as we've gone through this, I would really try to interpret the book on its own terms before going to other parts of Scripture to import what you learn from there. If you guys notice, for example, when I've been preaching the Gospel of Mark, for example, I rarely, if ever, will refer to Matthew or Luke or John. Because originally, Mark had his own agenda, his own idea of how he wanted to communicate who Jesus is, and it's a self-contained unit within itself. And so in my study, from time to time, I'll refer to the other accounts, like I did this week, or actually even today, for study purposes, but oftentimes I really want to understand Mark for Mark's sake. And it's the same thing with Revelation. I want to understand Revelation on its own grounds and how it presents itself. But there is still value in going to other parts of Scripture, and there are principles. A general principle of reading the Bible is that you should interpret the more unclear parts with the more clear ones. The more vague or unclear passages, you should interpret with the clearer ones, and the clearer ones should win out because they're more explicit. And we talked about, I think, a little bit about that with, I think, some of the epistles and things like that, or talking about Acts. And, things happen in Acts, they're described, but it's unclear. Did Luke intend, who wrote Acts, for this to be a pattern for all time for the church? And if it's not mentioned in the epistles, I tend to think not, because it's probably going to be reinforced explicitly in the epistles if something in Acts intended to be a practice for all times, for all churches. And so that's an example of the more clear, explicit passage, do this or don't do this, helps us understand the more unclear passage, which is a narrative, where there's no direct instruction whether we should continue to do this or not. So one example, going back to the book of Acts, is it said the early Christians were selling all their goods and had everything in common. Some people read that passage, see, like the church should just be one great communism commune. And it's like, well, Luke's saying that's what the early church in Jerusalem did. But there's no command in there that that's what the church should do for all times. And you don't see that command that every Christian needs to sell everything they had. And as Paul addresses in his epistles, he talks to the rich, he talks to the poor, he talks to the slave, he talks to the slave master, people in different socioeconomic positions. And his answer isn't to all of them is, set every slave free, everyone's got to be economically equal, sell everything you have. No, he gives instructions to each of them of, hey, to the rich, this is what you need to do. To the slave owner, this is what you need to do. To the slave, this is what you need to do. To the poor. But there are passages that talk about caring for other brothers and Christian sisters in need. There are passages about not turning your back on them, about the church providing for them. There's passages where we see Paul setting an example and collecting relief for the saints and other churches and all these things. So, again, we let the explicit, clear passages interpret the less explicit and the less clear passages. Cross-reference the Old Testament. Identify structure and repetition. Something we've talked a lot about in the other books, but I would encourage you in Revelation as well. Revelation certainly does have a structure, and you'll kind of need to decide what do you think? Do you think these are events that are linear, that Revelation sort of progresses and it's happening left to right? Is it recapitulating? Is it really just telling the same story from different perspectives? Is it doing a bit of both? Is it actually looking back on things that already happened? And that will really help you understand the structure because, for example, if you're really heavy into the recapitulation, you'll have to decide where does the cycle end and where does it begin? And where does it start over? Because you're going to say it's going to start over again in the cycle. If you're somebody who's more, hey, things are happening in the future, more futures, you're going to have to decide, okay, like when does one event begin and the other one end? And where do these events fit together in this timeline that I'm building in my mind? And if you're a preterist, you're going to have to decide, hey, where in history did these things actually get fulfilled in the past along the timeline? So trying to study the structure of the actual book and repetition will depend on your view of it. And then lastly, keeps God's providence in Christ central. And I've already mentioned that about Christ winning and ruling and reigning is we just want to keep that in central, be generous to other Christians in that way. That's something we all do agree on, and that's very evident in Revelation. The last warning I'll give about Revelation is be very wary when people try to map on current events onto Revelation. There's always some guy who's like, I figured it out. I put all the numbers together. I did the math. Here's my chart of things. And it's going to happen on this day. I'm like, first of all, literally Jesus was like, nobody knows. John didn't give a specific date either. Specific time and date. But all that to say is just be careful, I think, of mapping on events, especially if you're somebody who's more in that futurist event of, like, for example, I do believe there will probably be a future time in which some sort of Antichrist figure does rule over some sort of overarching government that seems to exercise great power over the world. Who that will be and what that will look like and all that, I'm like, I don't really know. But I know I'm called to live as a faithful Christian even as that happens. But I'm not caught up in trying to predict, like, oh, it's going to be some guy from Israel or it's going to be from China. Or like recently I saw something on the internet talking about with the things happening in the Middle East, like, oh, this guy likes like black Arabian horses, and somewhere in the Old Testament it mentions like black Arabian, and I'm like, oh my gosh, guys, this is not what God gave this for. He gave it as an encouragement to Christians. So again, the symbols can represent real things, and we can have confidence in those real things, but just be really careful when people come at it from that angle of trying to tell you this is exactly how it's going to be, or this is what the mark of the beast is. Like, people say that, and I'm like, people have been saying that this is what it's going to be, or this is the Antichrist figure forever. People like Antichrist. Like, during Martin Luther and the Reformation, he thought it was the Pope. And then people have thought it was going to be Adolf Hitler. And then people thought it was going to be Mussolini or other world leaders. People thought it was going to be Trump. Like, there's just, people keep trying to predict who it is. And I'm like, I don't think that's why Revelation was given. For us to try to map it on, to try to guess this specific person. But it doesn't dismiss, yes, there may be a real person someday who's the Antichrist. But also the way, even when I think about it, two things with Antichrist is, one, is like you read epistles like 1 John, and there's some sense in which John says, look, there's already Antichrist here. The spirit of the Antichrist is here. Persecution of the church, totally anti-God things, like that spirit of disobedience and rebellion in some ways is already here, although it might culminate in this particular figure sort of controlled by Satan. So there's things like that to be aware of. I'm trying to lose my train of thought of what I was going to say now. But yeah, just be careful when people do that and get into to those specific things. Well, any last questions, thoughts? Hopefully that was helpful for Revelation. At least a starting basis. You could dig in a lot more. Yeah.
I just got I think when I read Revelations, the thing that I really draw from there is the holiness of God.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's how I approach Revelations. It shows us that God is an extremely powerful and holy God.
Yeah, he's exercising his sovereignty over the world with clarity and with visuals throughout the book of Revelation.
And what will happen will happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, I do look out for those things sometimes. And we talks about the mark of the beast, with our technology, the way it's going, or, I see where that's all.
Yeah.
But the other thing I wanted to ask you, it talks about the great whore.
Of Babylon, yeah.
Yeah, that perverts the whole world. Do you think there's any chance that could be America?
I mean, it could end up being America, but also, like I said, my view is it's both a future. I think there will probably come a time where there's some great cultural government influence that is that. That's perpetuated by Satan. But in other ways, right, like, in some ways that's already here. That's just the world and Satan's system. In other ways, we've seen that recapitulated throughout history. Like, if you guys read history, guys, like, America tracks right on to the Roman Empire. Like, it's pretty far. Like, the immorality we're in, same thing happened in the Roman Empire as far as just homosexuality was rampant, people ripping each other off, taxes, rulers fighting over authority, things like that. So in the same way, I think really Babylon, so to speak, from when Babylon actually existed until now, there's been all kinds of Babylons. But it seems to me also there will be some also great Babylon that we're headed towards. So all of them to me are true. That's what I mean. I think they could represent all three. But yeah, the truth is, I don't know. Yeah. But it could end up being a nation like America. We don't know. But it could be another nation. It could be a nation that don't even exist yet.
The other thing is just be prepared.
Yeah. Because even, like in the past, like some of you who are probably less young remember, like, right, even with the UN and stuff. And when that started forming, people were like, oh, here we go. World government is coming in. They're going to take over everything. And now the UN's a joke to the rest of the world. And we're like, yeah, they're not really going to do anything. They got no military power. They got nothing. So people have tried to guess. And even the whole 666 people are like, it's going to be the microchip in the hand. I'm like, we basically already have that. It's just not in your hand. You just hold it in your pocket. So, but there'll come a time where I'm sure there will be microchips in the hand. Some people already have them. I think some genuine Christians will get it, and I'm not going to be the one screaming from the pulpit, "You're not a Christian, that's the mark of the beast." Because I don't know that that's the case. Maybe it would be something like that, but I don't know. Whether it's wise to get something microchipped in your hand, that will be another conversation Christians definitely will need to have, of how we interact with technology and what it means to be embodied creatures and all those things. But
But if it's like, if it's some sort of sign that you're not a true Christian, right? There's got to be a moral compromise associated with it, right?
yes.
It can't just be, oh, I had a surgery done. It's got to be like, I signed the paperwork that says I hate Christianity, I hate Christ. You know?
Yeah, and that's where reading Revelation in context, it's very obvious. Whatever this thing mark is involved with moral compromise and a denial of Christ and his lordship. And and I'm sure there's some people who think, having a smartphone where any government or anyone can track you at any minute, like that's already the mark of the beast. So, but like I said, it doesn't dismiss that there may be something one day, but I just don't think it's just kind of silly to me too, because I've talked to people and I'm like, do you really think there's going to be a genuine Christian and then they get a mark and then they're like, oh, I didn't know, like this was it. And God's like, oh, not, like you loved Lord Jesus and repent of all your sin, but you accidentally got the mark. Like that ain't how it's going to work. It's going to be people who clearly reject Christ, his lordship, his reign, and don't trust in him for salvation. So, yeah.
And when you see your Christian brothers on top of their roofs, saying, I can't buy or sell anything, maybe you should be with them.
Yeah.